up, everybody? Welcome back. I'm Will, and this is The People's Health. In the last episode, we discussed the policy of redlining. What exactly was it? What happened that led up to it? And what were some of the things that happened because of it? We learned about the color coding system that was implemented by the HOLC. We learned about what exclusionary zoning laws and racially restricted covenants were. We also learned how the history of these practices affect the reality of racial disparities and inequalities experienced by many in this country today. In case you missed it, here's the link. Check it out when you have a chance. In this episode, we're going to continue where the last one left off by discussing urban renewal and interstate highway construction. This is part 2 of the history of redlining, so strap in as we take a trip into our past to better understand our present. Let's go. The Fair Housing Act of 1968 restricted racial discrimination in housing. It set out to end the legally sanctioned redlining-like policies implemented or enforced by the Federal Housing Administration. Almost 20 years before that, another housing policy was passed by Congress, the Housing Act of 1949. This act provided loans and grants for cities to acquire and clear areas considered blighted. A blighted area was one that was considered to have fallen into despair, was decrepit, deteriorated, or just plain bad to look at. Guess which areas predominantly got this designation? Yeah, you guessed it. Black dominant areas. The Fair Housing Act allowed cities to get these areas and sell them to private developers for redevelopment in a process called urban renewal through the use of eminent domain. Some of the redevelopment that resulted from urban renewal projects included housing for middle-income white people and institutions such as hospitals, universities, and civic centers. Why pass such a program though? Well, after World War II, urban life wasn't, how should I say this, the best. Urbanites suffered from things like deindustrialization, overcrowding, and land values that were plummeting, all due to people moving out to the suburbs and commercial and industrial outmigration from cities in a sort of urban exodus. Urban renewal was a failure for the most part, with very little successes, but for black families it was devastating. By the late 1950s, cities throughout the country were displacing families of color at a rate much higher than their share of the population. Earlier this year, the University of Richmond's Digital Scholarship Lab released a comprehensive report on urban renewal projects in the U.S. titled Renewing Equality. I have posted a link to the digital report in the video description below. I suggest checking it out. It's full of fascinating information. According to the report, in the life of the program, which ended in 1974, $13 billion in federal urban renewal grants were awarded to over 1,200 municipalities. In at least half of those cities, more than 330,000 families were displaced. In many of those cities, at least 2/3 of those families were people of color. Now get this. Residents that had been displaced were meant to receive some type of compensation, relocation assistance, or placement in public housing. But these federally guaranteed measures were too often insignificant, late in coming, or never delivered. The original Housing Act of 1949 focused mainly on housing, but in 1954, it was amended to include the urban redevelopment plans we mentioned earlier. What's interesting about the second act was that it came as a response to the ongoing civil rights movement happening throughout America. Think about this. At the same time that African Americans were engaged in the most significant fight for rights since the post-Civil War era, and the Supreme Court's decision in the landmark case Brown v. Board of Education, where the pro-segregation practices of separate but equal were declared unconstitutional. At the same time that was happening, the federal government was engaged in Negro clearance, the reinforcement of the ghetto, and the use of federal resources and powers to sanction and in some instances impose segregation. Get this, American historian Arnold R. Hirsch wrote in a paper written for the journal Housing Policy Debate, family public housing increasingly became a minority relocation program locked in the urban core, while government subsidies brought home ownership and suburban mobility within the reach of the white middle class. In essence, those in charge went from seeing separate but equal as wrong to being completely okay with separate but adequate. Now, whether or not it was actually adequate was another story. James Baldwin once told a story about a boy he interviewed in San Francisco. You know what? I'm going to let the great James Baldwin tell it himself.
He said, I got no country, I've got no flag. Now, he's only 16 years old. And I couldn't say you do. I don't have any evidence to prove that he does. They were tearing down his house because San Francisco is engaging, as most northern cities now are engaged, is something called urban renewal, which means moving the Negroes out. It means Negro removal. That is what it means. And the federal government is an accomplice to this fact. Now we're talking about human beings. There's not such a thing as a monolithic wall or some abstraction called the Negro problem. These Negro boys and girls who at 16 and 17 don't believe the country means anything that it says, don't feel they have any place here on the basis of the performance of the entire country.
Well, now, Jim...
No, am I exaggerating?
No, I certainly could not say that you're exaggerating.
And he really wasn't. In New York City, Robert Moses, the master builder of that city, called by some the shaper of the modern city, a completely controversial figure of the urban planning field. Moses was responsible for the displacing of hundreds of families in New York City, uprooting several neighborhoods by building expressways through them, contributing to the ruining of my beloved South Bronx. And for my New York sports fans watching this, you can blame him for the Dodgers and Giants leaving as well. One example of that in New York City, like the 99th Street West Side black community that existed prior to urban renewal. But check out the video link in the description titled The Tragedy of Urban Renewal for a short snippet of that story. It is important to understand that the effects of urban renewal were made much worse by the construction of the interstate system. Now, the interstate system was implemented by the 1956 Federal Aid Highway Act. President Eisenhower had several reasons for passing it: to provide a modern, efficient highway system, essential to meet the needs of the growing population, our expanding economy, and our national security. In terms of expanding and modernizing the highway system, the act accomplished that. But what it also did was subsidize suburbanization of white families and jobs from urban areas to the suburbs, while at the same time destroying long-established minority communities. 41,000 miles of highway were constructed, connecting the country's major cities. Cool, right? Would have been if they wouldn't have done it at the expense of predominantly black neighborhoods. In just the first 20 years of this act, more than 1 million Americans were displaced, most of them low-income people of color. To make matters worse, there was no federal funding for relocation for those whose homes had been destroyed. Robert Moses built 416 miles of parkways in NYC. In doing so, he forced 250,000 people out of their homes, then segregating low-income residents into public housing projects. You know, these projects, and these projects, and these projects. Robert Moses was such a bad guy that he directed the building of tunnels leading to Jones Beach in Long Island too low for buses to pass. Because get this, he knew that a larger percentage of poor and black residents use public transportation in the form of buses. The low clearance was a good way to keep buses out of Jones Beach. So that was part 2 of the history of redlining. I hope you all enjoyed it, learned something new, and share it with someone else. In the next episode, we're going to look at how communities historically linked to redlining have contributed in a negative way to health disparities in those communities, and how this had been made worse by COVID-19. In honor of the anniversary of the death of the great James Baldwin, I suggest you listen to his 1963 interview linked in the description. Do you have anything you want to share, including topics you might want to see explored on this channel? Don't forget to leave a comment below. Also, more importantly, do not forget to subscribe, click the bell for notifications on new episodes, and of course, like this video. Check us out again in a couple of weeks. I'm Will, and this is The People's Health. Remember, take care of yourselves and each other. Peace.